It was New Year's Eve, the moment everyone had been waiting for. The clock ticked down to the final seconds of the year, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. The atmosphere was electric, filled with anticipation. On every corner, people were preparing to usher in the next year with fireworks, champagne, and hopes for a fresh start. But in the quiet of an unassuming street in downtown Los Angeles, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that no one could have predicted. Elon Musk, the name that had come to symbolize everything from electric cars to space exploration, stood quietly in the midst of a crowd. He was far from his usual boardrooms and rocket launches, dressed not in the sleek suit typical of a tech mogul, but in a simple jacket, standing with his hands in his pockets, watching the sea of people all around him. The countdown on the giant digital screen above the square began its final descent. The familiar buzz of the crowd grew louder as voices began to rise in unison. What would drive a man like Elon Musk to leave the comfort of his usual life, away from his companies, his private world, and step into an anonymous celebration in the middle of a bustling city street? It was the quiet plea of a single soul who was unknowingly about to change the course of his night. In the corner of the square, sitting on a bench, a woman named Clara watched the world around her with a far-off look in her eyes. Clara was a self-made woman, successful in her own right, a tech innovator like Musk, but with a heart burdened by a recent loss that no amount of money could mend. Her latest project had fallen through, and as the year was drawing to a close, she had been left with nothing but the weight of disappointment. The shimmering lights and joyous cheers of the crowd only highlighted the hollow feeling in her chest. Clara had told herself that she wasn't going to let the night pass her by. But the weight of the past year clung to her. The absence of her partner, the feeling of defeat, and the long hours spent on something that hadn't come to fruition all made her wonder if anything would ever change. It was in that moment, amidst the clamor of New Year's Eve revelers, that her eyes met the gaze of Elon Musk across the crowd. He had been watching her, not in a curious way, but with a knowing look, like someone who could sense when someone was lost. For a moment, Clara thought she might be imagining it. After all, who would notice someone like her in the sea of thousands? But there was something in the way Musk approached her, in the way his eyes held the calmness of someone who had already seen the worst of life and still chose to reach out. He stood before her now, the distant hum of the crowd still buzzing, but for a brief, surreal moment, it was just the two of them. Without words, he took a seat beside her, his presence steady, and in that brief pause before the world exploded with joy, something shifted. As the countdown to midnight ticked on, Clara's attention wavered between the celebration around her and the man who had taken a seat beside her. She hadn't expected anyone to approach her, let alone someone as influential as Elon Musk. But there he was, sitting beside her in silence, as if they shared some unspoken understanding. The noise of the crowd faded into the background, leaving only the faint ringing of her thoughts. She glanced at him, unsure of what to say. Elon Musk wasn't someone she could easily relate to. While her own work had centered on building groundbreaking technology, Musk's reputation loomed over hers in a way that made her feel small and insignificant. He had changed the world with his ideas, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and yet here he was, an enigmatic figure seated beside her, without saying a word. But as she finally mustered the courage to speak, the words caught in her throat. "Why are you here?" she blurted out, her voice almost drowned by the celebration going on just a few feet away. Musk gave a faint smile, his eyes soft but intense. "I was hoping I could find someone who needed a little kindness tonight," he said simply, as though the answer was obvious. Clara raised an eyebrow, unsure of how to respond. "Kindness? From you? Why?" Elon's smile didn't waver, but there was a certain sadness in his eyes. Sometimes, even the most successful people need to feel seen. Not as innovators, not as billionaires, but as people. People who are trying to find meaning. Clara's mind raced. She'd spent so much of her life consumed with achievement, with proving herself to others and making her mark on the world. Yet here she was, sitting next to one of the most successful men alive, and he was talking about needing kindness, about being seen for something deeper. Something that spoke to her on a level she wasn't used to acknowledging. Before she could respond, a loud cheer erupted from the crowd. The countdown had reached its final moments. The square seemed to explode with energy. People around them began clinking glasses, shouting, hugging, and letting go of the past year. Yet in the midst of it all, Clara felt herself slipping into a kind of quiet detachment. She couldn't help it. There was too much weighing on her heart. As the clock struck midnight, a brilliant burst of fireworks lit up the sky above them. But in that moment, something unexpected happened, something that had nothing to do with the chaos around them. A man in his 30s, wearing a faded jacket and holding a crumpled sign that read, "Lost everything, help please," appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face strained with hunger and desperation. The moment Clara saw him, her heart lurched. She knew what it felt like to feel invisible, like life had handed you a string of failures. And she could tell this man's soul was frayed by those very same threads. She started to rise from her seat instinctively, but as she did, she saw Musk's hand gently rest on her arm, his fingers light but firm, halting her. "Do you see him?" Musk asked, his voice quiet, but filled with purpose. Clara followed his gaze. The man was standing a few yards away, awkwardly holding out the sign, trying to get anyone's attention. Clara nodded, uncertain of where this conversation was leading. "Do you think you will get help tonight? Do you think anyone here will see him? Or are they all too wrapped up in their own lives to notice?" Clara looked at the crowd. Most were still celebrating, too absorbed in their own joy to pay attention to the man at the edge of the crowd. She felt a twinge of guilt, mixed with something she couldn't quite identify. Musk stood up, his movements deliberate. Sometimes, one small act can change everything. It can change someone's night, and perhaps even their life. Clara looked at him, the implications of his words starting to sink in. He wasn't talking about a grand gesture or some lavish act of charity. It was a choice to see someone, to offer kindness when it was least expected. Without another word, Musk approached the man with the sign, his hand reaching into his pocket. Clara watched in stunned silence as he handed the man a small stack of bills, far more than anyone would expect for a single moment of charity. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. And then the most remarkable thing happened. The crowd around them, who had been celebrating only moments before, began to notice the interaction. People stopped, looked, and for the first time that night, the man wasn't invisible anymore. One by one, they began to approach him, offering help in various forms, some with money, others with food, and a few with kind words. Clara watched, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just the money, or the gesture that had changed the moment, it was the ripple effect of kindness that Musk's act had set in motion. People were seeing each other, truly seeing one another for the first time that night. In that fleeting moment, Clara realized something that would stay with her forever. Kindness, no matter how small, could spark magic. And that magic had the power to change everything. As the crowd around the man with the sign grew, Clara sat frozen on the bench, her mind racing. The sight of Elon Musk giving away money was almost surreal, but what lingered in her thoughts wasn't just the act of kindness, it was the effect it had on everyone around them. People weren't just looking at the man in need, they were really seeing him for the first time. In that moment, something inside Clara began to shift, but she couldn't tell if it was hope or guilt. She hadn't expected this night to turn into something so profound, and yet here she was, caught in the undertow of emotions she had spent months burying. She glanced at Musk, who was returning to his seat beside her, his face unreadable. The weight of his quiet action was unmistakable, and she felt herself caught between admiration and frustration. Why had he done it? He was one of the richest men in the world, what was a few $100s to him? Clara wanted to ask, but the words felt too small, too trivial, in the face of what had just happened. And yet, a part of her felt angry. Angry at herself. Angry at the world. Here was a man who had everything, yet he was out on the streets, making a difference in a way that she had failed to do herself. Was she so caught up in her own failures, her own self-doubt, that she had forgotten the power of simple actions? As the cheers of the crowd faded, replaced by the more subdued energy of reflection, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. She had worked so hard to build her career, to leave a legacy, but in the process, she had lost sight of the simple things: human connection, empathy, kindness. She had lived in her bubble, convincing herself that her success in tech would make up for everything else. But now, with the flicker of 1,000 faces illuminated by the fireworks, she realized just how hollow that had been. "Why didn't you just give him the money?" Clara asked, her voice sharp without meaning to be. She didn't even know why she had asked it, only that something about the way Musk had approached the situation felt almost too deliberate, too staged. Musk turned to her, his expression unchanging, but there was something deeper in his eyes. "It's not just about the money," he said slowly, almost as though weighing each word. "It's about making people feel seen. It's about giving someone the chance to believe that there's more to life than just surviving." Clara's lips parted in frustration. "But you didn't have to do that. You could have done it privately, no one would have even known." "You're right," Musk acknowledged, his voice still calm, "but how many people here tonight will remember him tomorrow? How many will make an effort to make sure he has a future?" His gaze drifted back to the crowd, now dispersing as the night wore on. "You see, kindness isn't just about the one moment. It's about changing the narrative, one small step at a time." Clara let out a sharp breath. "I don't know if I can change the narrative," she muttered, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of her internal conflict, the pressure of expectations she had placed on herself, felt like a wall she could no longer climb. Every decision she had made to get to where she was had come at the cost of something deeper. She'd neglected the personal, the emotional, the human connections in favor of career, of status, of proving herself. And now, here she was, on the verge of a breakdown, wondering if it was all worth it. Musk seemed to sense the struggle within her. "You don't need to change everything in a single moment," he said softly. "But every act of kindness you put out into the world is a thread in a bigger tapestry." Clara shook her head, fighting back the bitter tears threatening to fall. "I've spent so much time chasing things that don't matter. Now I don't know what to do with all this." She motioned vaguely to the crowd, the city, her own life that now felt distant, out of her control. The pressure in her chest mounted, the weight of the world now crushing her under its intensity. The ringing of fireworks in the distance seemed to echo in her mind, a stark contrast to the silence that enveloped her heart. She had never felt so lost. As the final fireworks faded into the night sky, Clara sat in silence, her mind spiraling with all the emotions she had kept locked away for far too long. She looked around at the now empty square, where the echoes of joy had slowly dissipated, leaving only the hum of distant traffic and the soft rustling of wind. But it wasn't the silence that unnerved her, it was the weight of her own thoughts, the realization that she had been running from something far deeper than just her failures. And then, something unexpected happened. The man with the sign, the one Musk had helped, returned to the square. His hands were no longer trembling with desperation. His posture had changed, as if the weight of his burden had been lifted, if only for a moment. He was walking towards them, a hesitant smile on his face. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Was this some sort of sign? She had never believed in fate or destiny, but there was something profound about this moment, something that felt like a shift. The man approached them, stopping just a few feet away, his eyes searching. "I don't mean to intrude," he began, his voice rough but filled with gratitude. "But I wanted to thank you. For what he did, for seeing me." He nodded towards Musk, his gaze lingering on Clara for a moment. "I've been on the streets for years, and tonight, for the first time in a long time, someone looked at me like I was worth something." Clara opened her mouth to speak but found herself at a loss for words. She had never understood the full scope of what it meant to be seen, to be acknowledged in a world that often overlooked the most vulnerable. But now, looking at this man, his face softened by kindness, Clara felt the sting of her own loneliness, the isolation that had built up over the years. She hadn't just been hiding from her failures, she had been hiding from the connections she had neglected. The man continued, his voice cracking with emotion. That act, it wasn't just money. It was hope. It was showing me that maybe I'm not invisible. Maybe I can still make something of myself. And in that moment, Clara understood. The true magic wasn't in the act of charity, it was in the belief it inspired. Musk had given this man more than money, he had given him hope. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt the stirring of something new within her, something more powerful than her career or her achievements. It was a reminder that kindness, compassion, and connection were the threads that held everything together. I understand, Clara whispered, her voice shaky. She wasn't sure if she meant it for herself, the man, or Musk, but in that moment, she finally understood the real value of seeing others. The night stretched on, but Clara felt as though time had stopped. As the man with the sign walked away, his demeanor lighter, his hope renewed, something shifted within her. The weight that had once pressed down so heavily on her chest now felt a little less suffocating. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and for the first time in a long time, she felt alive, not as an inventor, not as a success story, but as a human being. Looking at Elon Musk beside her, Clara realized something she hadn't allowed herself to understand until now: kindness wasn't just a means to an end. It wasn't about checking a box on a philanthropic list or feeling good about yourself after helping someone. Kindness was about connection, about creating ripples that reached far beyond the moment. Elon hadn't done it for praise or recognition. He hadn't given the man money because it was convenient or easy, he had done it because he saw a person in need, and he chose to offer something that mattered. He didn't just change that man's night, he changed Clara's perception of what it meant to truly live. Clara sat still for a long time, contemplating. She had spent so much of her life working to be seen for her accomplishments, thinking that the more she achieved, the more she would matter. But she hadn't realized that the connections she had ignored were the very things that could have filled her life with purpose. In the weeks that followed, Clara changed. She no longer saw people just as obstacles to her success or figures to be outdone. She began reaching out to others, offering help without expectation, focusing not on what she could gain but on what she could give. Her work continued, but she didn't bury herself in it as she had before. Instead, she found a balance, a way to thrive in both her career and her connections with others. Elon, too, had undergone his own transformation. While he was no stranger to giving, there was something about that night that felt different to him, too. Seeing Clara's response, witnessing the ripple of kindness spread through the crowd, reminded him of a truth he had long forgotten: change didn't always come through technology or innovation. Sometimes, it came through the simplest, most human moments. When he looked at Clara now, he saw a different woman. One who had shed the armor of self-doubt and had embraced the power of empathy. A woman who understood that the true measure of success wasn't in accolades or numbers, it was in the lives you touched, the hearts you healed, and the kindness you gave away without expecting anything in return. And as the new year moved forward, they both walked a little taller, empowered by the knowledge that sometimes, the smallest act of kindness could change everything. As Clara embraced her newfound sense of purpose, her transformation began to ripple outward, touching more lives than she could have imagined. She began speaking openly about the power of kindness in her public talks, blending her technical expertise with a message that was deeply personal. Her words resonated with audiences who had long viewed success through the lens of achievement alone. Clara shared her story, the rise and fall of her career, the hollow victories, and the powerful moment when she realized that true success wasn't measured by accolades but by the connections you fostered along the way. Her talks became a source of inspiration, and soon, more people reached out to her. Young entrepreneurs, engineers, and creatives alike, who had once been focused solely on competition and innovation, began to reframe their goals. They asked themselves not just what they wanted to achieve, but how they wanted to make others feel along the way. Clara's message became a catalyst for change within her industry. She worked to create programs that focused on both innovation and social responsibility, encouraging her peers to think not just about their products but about the impact those products had on the world and its people. The effect of Musk's gesture continued to unfold as well. His simple act of kindness that night had sparked a movement in the city. Local organizations that had long been fighting for the homeless were galvanized by the attention drawn to the issue, and many more people, inspired by Musk's example, began volunteering and donating to causes they had once ignored. A sense of community, previously frayed by apathy, began to re-emerge. The man who had received help that night was able to secure a place to stay, find a job, and, most importantly, restore his sense of dignity. He wasn't the only one. Many others, emboldened by the ripple effect of kindness, reached out for help and found a network of support. For Musk, the experience changed his perspective on giving. His philanthropy took on a new dimension, not just financial, but personal. He began to focus on small acts of kindness, intentionally engaging with those around him and investing time in causes that impacted people directly. His work began to reflect a more holistic approach, one that combined technology with a deeper sense of social responsibility. Together, Clara and Musk had unknowingly sparked a wave of change that touched countless lives. It wasn't the fame of their names or the scale of their wealth that had mattered, it was their shared realization that, through simple acts of kindness, they had helped others rediscover their own humanity. And in doing so, they had created a world where people no longer needed to prove their worth, but instead could live with the assurance that they were seen, valued, and loved. The New Year's Eve party had wrapped up, and the crowd was thinning out, but Clara couldn't shake the restless feeling gnawing at her. The city was alive with energy, yet she felt more isolated than ever, torn between her past and the future she was trying to build. As she stood on the balcony, watching the final fireworks of the night light up the sky, her phone buzzed with a message from Musk: "Meet me at the park. There's something I need to show you." Clara walked briskly through the empty streets, her heart pounding. When she arrived at the park, she saw him standing near a small crowd, the same man with the sign from that night. But this time, something was different. The man, no longer holding a sign, was surrounded by people, strangers, all gathered to support him. They were handing him blankets, food, and donations, showing him the same kindness Musk had shown him that night. Musk turned to Clara, his face serious yet calm. "It's happening. It's not just about us anymore, it's bigger than that. This man, and others like him, are being seen. The ripple we started has turned into a movement. Look at what's happening here." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She watched as the man smiled, his once dull eyes now full of life. He was no longer just a symbol of need, he was a person, surrounded by a community that cared. In that moment, Clara realized that this wasn't about a single act of kindness or about changing the lives of one or two people. It was about a new way of seeing the world, a world where kindness wasn't rare or extraordinary but essential. The people around her weren't just giving for the sake of charity. They were giving because they had rediscovered something important, the power to change the world, one small act at a time. Clara smiled, her heart full, as the fireworks lit up the sky once again. She knew, at last, that her journey had come full circle. As the final echoes of fireworks faded into the night, Clara stood beside Musk, the bustling park now quiet, save for the soft conversations of those gathered around the man who had once been invisible. Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, a calm that came from the realization that her journey had led her to something far more meaningful than she had ever expected. In the weeks that followed, Clara's life began to take on a new rhythm. Her work, once consumed with deadlines and numbers, was now balanced with outreach and mentorship. She collaborated with local charities, using her resources to bridge the gap between technology and human connection. She spoke at conferences, not just about innovation but about empathy, kindness, and the impact of community. Clara's message became a beacon for others, showing them that true success was found in lifting others up, not just in climbing to the top. Musk, too, had changed. His role in the movement had sparked something deeper in him, and he found himself more involved in grassroots initiatives. The simple act of kindness he had shown that night had morphed into something much larger than he had ever imagined, and it reminded him of the power of personal engagement over financial transactions. The man with the sign, now a symbol of resilience and hope, had turned his life around, finding steady work and a place to call home. He kept in touch with Clara and Musk, always expressing his gratitude for the kindness that had transformed his life. As the seasons changed, Clara continued to reflect on that night, on the magic that had been sparked at midnight. She knew the world wasn't perfect, but now, she believed in the possibility of change. Small acts of kindness, she realized, could have profound, lasting effects. And that belief, more than anything, would be her guiding light moving forward.